to the cloud. I'm going to let people in. Let's get started. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to start in just a second. Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Maya, and I am the Director of Behavioral Insights Group. We're so delighted to have Professor Cass Sunstein with us today. He's joining us for an hour, answering a series of pressing questions on the history of nudge. We look forward to engaging Cass on the wide-ranging questions regarding the history of nudge, how it affects our lives today, and how he sees the theory applications developing in the future. Here to formally introduce Professor Sunstein is BISG social media lead, Jillian Grabber. Jillian is the member of the Behavioral Insights student group and is currently serving as the group's social media lead. She's an undergrad studying psychology at Harvard and is a user researcher at the large technology company. And big thank you to Jillian and the entire BISG team involved in making this event possible. Jillian?
Thanks, Maya, and hello, everybody. Before we get started, I just want to call out, we'd love to keep this conversation going, both during this talk and after on our social media. So I'm going to just drop our Twitter in the chat. Feel free to engage with us there. And now it's truly an honor to present to you a fireside chat today with Cass Sunstein. Cass is currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard and the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. He's worked with many governments and organizations, including the White House, World Health Organization, and the United Nations. Professor Sunstein is an author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books, including Nudge, with co-author Richard Thaler. To list all his accolades, we'd be here all day, so I'll keep it short, but just know it's truly an honor. I'm also happy to introduce two other BISG leaders. The first is Stephen Cantarutti. He's the outgoing programming lead for BISG and holds a behavioral science PhD focusing on trust in healthcare settings. He's currently working as a postdoc at the University of Calgary, where he studies the intersection of behavioral science and patient decision-making. Second is Stephen Morse, one of the outgoing co-presidents of the Behavioral Insights student group. He's also a current grad student in the design engineering program at Harvard. So with that, I'll hand it off.
All right, thank you, Jillian. And thank you everyone that's online to discuss Nudge, past, present, and future with us today. And of course, thank you, Professor Sunstein. How are you doing today? Where are you calling from?
This is from Washington, D.C., and I'm doing great because you are conducting this event. So I thank you for that.
Amazing. Well, I guess we can kind of just jump right in. And can you start by giving us a brief introduction to nudge theory? Tell us a little bit how you envisioned it evolving when you were still developing the concept before the publication of Nudge in 2008.
Okay, so thank you. I'll give you the short version. So Dick Thaler and I had written on the topic of anti-paternalism. So what we were saying is we're not pro-paternalism, but we're being against paternalism on the ground that sometimes people make decisions that make their lives go worse. So that idea of anti-paternalism didn't seem to have a lot of legs. It was at the end of a very long article. And then one day we had lunch and Dick said that in a workshop, he had responded to a very negative comment from one of his colleagues saying that you're a paternalist, Thaler. And he said, his response was, I'm paternalist, yeah, but a libertarian paternalist. And my reaction was the same as his, was, that's interesting. Maybe we can do something with that. And so we did a paper called Libertarian Paternalism is Not an Oxymoron. Actually, that was a very long law review article where I had the lead. And we did a short economics article where he had the lead called Libertarian Paternalism. And to our amazement, that duo of papers attracted a lot of interest, where people, academics, thought, sometimes maybe we can change the arrangement of something and maintain freedom of choice, and you'll get a different outcome. That's interesting. So it's liberty preserving, but it does have a paternalistic feature. As we saw the interest and elaboration by others in what we had struggled with, we thought, well, maybe there's a book here. And we developed various applications ranging from poverty reduction to the environment to savings to healthcare to lots of legal settings, and thought, this idea has generality. And the word nudge actually came, I'll tell that story if you like, but that came as a kind of organizing, simple term for what was an organizing, terrible term, libertarian paternalism. And we took the simpler.
Amazing. So when you guys were formulating this, was it primarily intended as a policy tool, or was that your vision, or did you think it was more broad?
We thought of it as a policy tool. So the basic idea was that there are a bunch of people who are really interested in mandates and bans, and there are other people who think that's terrible and just letting the market go is right, and that there was a set of options that had not been organized before, and we hope to be able to do that. And the idea was, if you work in the Department of Health and Human Services, you might think, how could we maintain freedom of choice, but help people live longer lives? Maybe there are things we can do about that. Or if you're working for an environmental agency, are there things you can do that can help people make choices that are good for their economic situation and good for their capacity to breathe clean air? Are there things you can do if you're at the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States or at some other environmental authority? I personally was and am very focused on highway safety, and thought, well, what can we do that is choice preserving for drivers, but reduces crashes and deaths? And so that was policy oriented. But from the start, we thought of policy in a very broad way. So I gave government examples, and I'm trained as a lawyer, so that's kind of where my mind goes. But we both thought a lot about private organizations also. Companies, nonprofits, universities. If you're thinking about healthcare or savings plans, a lot of that comes from the private sector. The private sector is often the solution to problems. So we thought the idea of nudge for good is something that maybe some companies would be responsive to.
Awesome. Great answer. Thank you. I'm going to pass it off to other Stephen for the next question.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you everybody for giving me the opportunity here. Thank you very much, Professor Sunstein, for joining us. My question for you is, we're experiencing chronically low trust in Western society today, which has obvious implications on our social and institutional ability to function. What effect does nudging from private sector organizations, specifically social media companies, have on our ability to exhibit some degree of self-determination and participate in civic democratic practices?
That's great, and a large question. So if, with your indulgence, let me back into it.
Sure.
So without crashing, I hope. So the best way to get trust is to earn it. So it's a little like if you want to fall asleep at night, to think, need to fall asleep, need to fall asleep, need to fall asleep. That's not going to work. Or if you want to be spontaneous, to tell yourself, I'm going to be spontaneous now. I'll remember at the party to be spontaneous. That's not going to work. So earning trust is getting trust is a byproduct of doing things that earn trust. There's an executive order that hasn't gotten a ton of attention from President Biden, that has gotten, to the extent that people have attended, bipartisan favorable reaction, and it has the word trust in it. It's an executive order on customer service. It calls out behavioral science. It is deeply informed by behavioral science. There's a lot of nudging in it. And the basic idea is in the vicinity of reduce time taxes on people. So take administrative burdens away, make things more automatic, make it so that if you're going to get a passport or a driver's license, these are just illustrations. You're not going to be in a Stephen King novel where there are creatures all around you who are threatening your well-being. And it is very specific about things that can make multiple government agencies do their jobs better, with the thought that that will create an increase in trust. Now, in the private sector, it's analogous. If you have, and I'm going to get to social media companies in a moment, if you have a company, let's call it, Toyota, and if it is trustworthy, it will be trusted unless something goes really sour. And if Toyota is trusted, it will be because there are a range of things it does that don't make people feel they've been betrayed. It might be that it just works really well, the car, or it might be if something goes wrong, there's something you can do to get it fixed that's easy and not humiliating or frustrating. And a lot of the strategies used by successful companies that are doing well, and we hope doing good as well, involve the use of nudging and behaviorally informed approaches to make sure, in the case of cars, that they're safer, that they don't have secret prices that are dripping on your head like water that makes you feel unsafe and, in the case of money, poor. So companies doing that. Now, for a social media company, it's a really large issue. Of course, is that the most boring thing anyone has ever said? Apologies for having said the most boring thing anyone's ever said. It's a really large issue. Let's think of a social media company, the artist formerly known as Facebook, so Meta. When that company is trusted, it's because its product is useful. There are no tricks being used by it, that people aren't giving up something involving, let's say, time or privacy or money in ways that they have, for reasons they haven't consented to, that there isn't some manipulation of them. And those things make the user experience positive and make trust increase. If you feel that the company's basic interest is in maximizing your engagement, it might work. You might spend a lot of time on the platform, but it might be that you don't trust it because you think it's manipulating you or trying to exploit your eyeballs or something. And that's a problem. So we know customer maximization can be a negative for customers, kind of ironically. I think you're getting at the question of kind of democracy, if I'm following, and the future of self-government in, let's say, nations that aspire to have that. And there are things companies can do that can be positive or negative. Social media companies, certainly. So one thing is, do they have nudges with respect to misinformation? Or let's say damaging falsehoods. If people say something about the polls are only going to be open between the hours of 11 a.m. and 11:45 a.m. today, and let's say that's a lie, what's done about that? And if nothing is done about that, then trust will diminish. And that's the right reaction if people are saying a lie about something like that. If what the company does in response to that is say something that's corrective, let's say it's a nudge that's corrective, then trust will probably increase. And we're talking about what is unambiguously a falsehood with respect to when the polls are open. And you can, apply that to anything under the sun, something that says that COVID is a hoax, that the more you smoke, the longer you live, that speed limits are made to be ignored, so please go 50 miles over them. And whatever you think the right approach to those are, there are some approaches that would be trust diminishing and also damaging to health and well-being. And we're kind of in the midst of that mud right now, aren't we?
Thank you very much for your response. It was a complicated question, but you did a great job unpacking all of that. So thank you. I'm now going to pass it on to Jillian for our next question.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Recent research has suggested that Western communication norms have shifted, specifically in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, as people are spending more and more time online. I'm wondering, can you speak to the role that nudging plays in interpersonal communication today? Are we nudging more than we used to with greater information at our disposal?
It's also a great question. One thing I've learned from collaborations with Daniel Kahneman, who's my frequent co-author, is to be very focused on what data we have. Lawyers sometimes speculate. Empirical social scientists want data. So for norms with respect to communications, what kind of shift we've observed as a result of online behavior, I wonder what's the specific hypothesis and how do we test it? So you could imagine something with respect to civility, which would shift. It could go in any number of directions. And I don't have a kind of clear intuition about that. You could imagine that face-to-face interactions in person involve more in the way of play and kind of mutually productive creativity than online interactions. I believe there's data that is supportive of that when people are talking together in person, they're running into each other in halls or informally engaging, that things happen that are more surprising and innovative than through online interactions. I believe, this is an intuition I do have, that being on time is a very strong norm in terms of online meetings, and in-person meetings less so. That's a testable hypothesis. Casual empiricism, as we call it, is supportive of that. I bet you have specific ideas in mind with respect to norms, and I'm kind of curious about what they are.
Yeah, so for example, bad faith communication is now in many cases the norm, as kind of like deliberately misleading communications or like approximate communications are often what companies are sharing, especially on social media. That was kind of one thing we were thinking.
Let me give an example which I think has a degree of practical urgency as well as being of keen theoretical interest that's in that domain. The term that's kind of caught on is dark patterns, where the idea is that there are online practices that end up tricking people to do something that it isn't in their interest to do. You can think of this as nudging for bad. That's not a fully inaccurate account of what dark patterns are. And I think we should do something about them. And it's much harder for them to happen in person for multiple reasons. Partly it's just so easy to produce a dark pattern. Here's an example. If you buy a copy of my latest book, something will happen, which is you will be automatically enrolled in buying copies of my future books. Now, if I say that explicitly, it's not the most charming thing, but it's not terrible because you know. If it's a part of the agreement, you buy a book by an author and you're going to buy their subsequent books, that's terrible if you don't know it. And some of what's happening online is there are shrouded or hidden purchases that people are committing themselves to, which aren't really clear unless you're paying a lot of attention. So that's an example of exploitation of limited attention on the part of our species and the use of it. Present bias, unrealistic optimism, inertia. For every bias under the sun, there is a dark pattern that exploits it. And that is much more easily done through online deception, fraud, manipulation than in person. You might say, at least at scale, you might say, and I'll just say, we need a right not to be manipulated. It's kind of a 21st century right that hasn't been invented yet. The 20th century invented a right to privacy, and whatever you think about the scope of it, that was a good thing to do. And our equivalent, I think, is a right not to be manipulated.
Thank you so much. It's a really important topic to talk about. I'd like to hand it back off to Stephen to keep up that conversation with another question.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that last answer, Professor Sunstein. My next question is, you recently published a paper, I think it was last year, touching on the decline or the threat to liberal ideology in modern Western/American society specifically. I really enjoyed the paper, highly recommend it to anybody out there. From your perspective, how do our norms of communication change in response to a changing ideological landscape? And to what degree does the shift in communication norms actually facilitate or accelerate the change in ideology?
Okay, as you asked that big question, I think of an unpublished footnote by John Rawls, maybe the greatest political philosopher of the 20th century. Never published the footnote, it's in a manuscript that floats around that says, we post a sign, no deep thinking here, things are bad enough already. So I'm going to start shallow at your deep question. Liberalism. And then we'll get to communication. So what is the beating heart of liberalism? There's a poem by Baudelaire, and it's a little scandalous to say, but there's a poem by Baudelaire called Get Drunk. And Baudelaire says, whatever you do, you must get drunk. And that if you feel time's burden on your shoulders, the sea, the moon, the wind, the breeze, the clock, everything is saying to you in one voice, you must get drunk with wine or poetry or virtue as you choose. And what Baudelaire's poem, it's a very liberal poem. It's saying exercise your own agency, choose. And it's saying choose what gets you drunk, where what's meant by drunk isn't literally, I don't think, necessarily inebriated, but makes you feel fully alive and you're that self which you feel whatever. If I had the word, I think you're getting what the words would look like. You're getting the music of the words, even though I don't quite have them. We all know what that is. For each of us, you know, for me, I confess often it's amazing work in behavioral economics. It's also tennis if it goes well. And for each of us, there's something like that. It might be participation in politics. It might be good works. It might be a night out with someone you love. So and this is, I think, the emphasis of liberalism on individual agency and a principle of individual dignity, which undergirds individual agency. Kind of the mischief and delight of Baudelaire's poem. Agency is at its core, and dignity is one layer beneath. Okay, so with communications, you can imagine a communication system that is respectful of individual agency, that treats people as subjects and as citizens, or you can imagine one that treats them as objects for manipulation or theft. You could imagine a communications technology that is emphatic on the importance of individual agency and sees it as a primary goal or not. And we observe features of both. So you can take Twitter, and there is a lot that's favorable to individual agency there. There's some that isn't. And how should we think about that? How do we operationalize the liberal ideal, let's say, of respect for persons as applied to Twitter? I think Twitter itself has thought a lot about that. Ideally, no. Often well, absolutely.
Thank you very much. I'm now going to pass it back to Steve Morse to ask our next question.
Awesome. So we touched on trust a little earlier, so I kind of want to revisit it. So the question is, can you reflect on the implications of nudging and creating effective channels of communication with the focus of trust? Does interpersonal nudging tend to engender trust between people? And what are the broader psychological implications associated with these maybe less direct communications as a result of nudging?
Okay, so let's be more concrete maybe than I've been about the categories that nudges fall in. And it's probably not useless to say many nudges are educative. So if you have disclosure, if you buy this, be careful, if you have a peanut allergy, it has peanuts. Or if you buy this, the number of calories are this, or this sunscreen will help you get a good tan, but it's not going to protect you against cancer. Or these medicines have risks for people with high blood pressure. So those are educative nudges. There are warnings and reminders, which aren't strictly information disclosure. They're not trying to put information in people in the way that information flatly does. A reminder might be intended to overcome limited attention or inertia, and a warning might be intended to trigger concern or fear in a way that could save someone's life. Think of beep, beep, beep on your car, which is a nudge. Don't keep backing up. Those with respect to, I think the concerns you identify in the interpersonal side, they aren't a problem for trust. They are trust increasing. So if your company, let's say, is educating you and warning you and reminding you, unless it's just really irritating you, it's overkill. I got it already. Stop reminding me. I'm trying to drive my car. But in general, these are trust promoting things. And if there isn't information about the features of a product that you're getting, if you aren't nudged to have full awareness of those, that can be a form of deception and covertness. So let's say, at least at first, educative nudges, which is a big universe of them, presumptively do well on the trust scale. Then there are architectural nudges, which are maybe more complicated. So let's suppose that the grocery store has apples and oranges and bananas right up front, and the brownies and fudge. Are you getting kind of hungry and eager? I am, as I say those words. The brownies and fudge are there, but they're not as conspicuous or visible as the apples and lettuce. That's an architectural nudge. Or if you're automatically enrolled in some program, you go to university and you're automatically in 5 programs, that's not educative, that's architecting you. Even if you are free to opt out, as you'd better be if it's to be a nudge, costless opt out, but it's architectural. I'm actually working on a book on this exact issue right now, and with data, and the data we have is, to my surprise, supportive of the following conclusion. That is that architectural nudges do not make people mistrustful or feel disempowered or sad. So if people are informed that they've been nudged in various ways, the data is very, I think, it's not obvious that this would be the finding, but people say, great, I got it. Thanks for telling me, and I like it. Now, if they're nudged through, if people are automatically enrolled in a program they despise, by which they're giving money, let's say, to the richest person in the world, they're not going to like that very much. But it's not because they've been defaulted. It's because they've been defaulted into something that they, why are you taking my money away and giving it to Jeff Bezos? That doesn't seem in my interest. So the qualification, I think, to what I just said, is for trust with respect to nudging, if they're in communication or architectural, is that there better be no deception or secrecy. Transparency is crucial. People don't like it if something is hidden. As a first approximation, at least they don't like that. And they also don't like it if they're being nudged in a direction that's inconsistent with their interests or their values. So I have a lot of data on this. If people feel they've been nudged to do something that violates their moral commitments or that's going to make their life worse, they're mad, not because they've been nudged, but because the direction they've been nudged. So we need a Bill of Rights for nudging, I think, and it would include transparency, consistency with the interests and values of the people being nudged, respect for relevant constitutional limits, and probably 4 or 5 other provisions in our Bill of Rights for nudges.
Awesome. I think that Bill of Rights idea is really interesting. So Maya, I'll pass it off to you for the last question here before we go to Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Yeah, we're so happy to see all your questions. Please do vote. But we do have one closing question before we move to audience questions. So Cass, you have an extensive background working in both law and public policy. In keeping with our topic on shifting communication approaches, can you speak to recent policy development that may serve to better safeguard personal data and discourage unchecked data-driven nudging, such as create more checks and balances behind nudge technology and nudge approaches?
Great. In the United States, the Federal Trade Commission has indicated an interest in dark patterns and recently released a policy statement about unconsented to terms and being caught up by, let's say, clever and maybe behaviorally very informed companies in transactions that people didn't know they were entering into. So that I think is a very good example of an initial step to try to counteract manipulative practices. And I hope we'll see a lot more of that in regulatory activity in Europe as well as in the United States. And it's reasonable to think that what the FTC has done in the United States is an opening step, but not the only step. With respect to social media companies, linking this question as one of the earlier questions, I do think it's fair to hope for more in the way, like a lot more in the way, both of self-regulation and of regulation. And this is a very fraught area, of course, but if we're talking about things that take people's money without their consent or their sufficient consent, or lead them to engage in behavior that is going to endanger their lives. To think about what kind of nudging maybe would be a good idea for that, to stop that, is on the regulatory side is a very worthwhile project.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am going to pass it on to Stephen to take the first question from the audience. Thank you, Cass. This was wonderful.
Thank you for all your responses, Professor Sunstein. Hugely enjoyable. The first question we have here is actually related to your last question, so it's a nice segue. Sean asks, what would you do about dark patterns if you could write a rule or regulation governing dark patterns? What would it say?
So I go directly at the worst practices, which include hidden fees of various sorts. The US government over the last few years has, in the context of airlines and investments, required disclosure of hidden fees. And the data is extremely supportive of the conclusion that this is in consumers' interests. So hidden fees, no. Second, I would go after automatic enrollment in terms that people haven't specifically consented to and may not know about. So if you buy X and you are automatically enrolled in Y, that's a big problem unless you have great clarity that you're enrolled in Y. Those would be the first two. You might want also to think about restrictions on what's called drip pricing and partition pricing, which are a little bit technical concepts, but think of them as being evil siblings, where people are facing costs that they didn't have. They could be like in a Marvel movie, they would be evil siblings with costumes and like fighting hard against Hulk and someone else we really care about. I would say Iron Man, but he's dead. So think of them as drip pricing and partition pricing could use regulating. We might think also, so I've called out 4 practices just now, we might also think of identifying a right not to be manipulated, and then have a kind of rough and ready definition, and then giving regulators some authority to address that, knowing that the ingenuity of the private sector is going to outrun any specific text.
That's great, thank you.
In this context, that's a bad thing. Usually the ingenuity of the private sector outrunning text, that's a great thing. That's why we have so many wonderful devices, some of which we're all looking at now. But the ingenuity of the private sector in thinking of ways to manipulate people, that's something that's very hard to specify today. So a concept like manipulation is worth considering as an umbrella.
That's great. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it on to Steve to ask our next audience question.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to pause for a second, and I know we've asked you a lot of questions, Cass. I wanted to make sure that you had an opportunity, if there was anything that you wanted to share with the crowd about things you're working on right now, or any pressing topics.
Well, thank you for that. I'll tell you what I'm working on right now. I'm doing a book with a neuroscientist on the topic of habituation. So the basic idea is if people engage in behavior X or exposed to stimulus Y, they will have diminishing sensitivity. So if you are subject to air pollution and it gets dirtier and dirtier and dirtier, or let's say you have to work at home and that gets more and more constant, the first exposure you might think, ouch. And then over time, you might end up thinking, I barely notice. So the human power to habituate is astounding. We can habituate to our own immorality. So there's data suggesting that if in an experimental setting, let's say the 5 of us were incentivized to lie, in the morning, our first lie, our amygdala in our brain is going to go crazy. It's going to be on fire. I'm lying. Oh no. But as the day goes on, by 5 in the afternoon, after let's say 25 incentivized lies, our amygdala says, what else is new? Our brain is not reactive. This is real data from neuroscientists. Think of that as a metaphor that people habituate to their own lying. They habituate to their own misconduct. They habituate to the lying and misconduct of others. They habituate to risk. They habituate to poverty. They habituate to jail. They habituate to pollution. And this is a kind of, I think, insufficiently explored island of behavioral science. I'm pretty excited about it. Both our ability to habituate is a fantastic blessing. To beat your head against the wall, against a situation you find yourself in, is not very much fun. On the other hand, it can make it so that things that are phenomenal, you basically don't even notice anymore. Or things that are horrible, you also don't notice anymore. And so that's not good. It could mean that injustice or deprivation create the psychological foundations of their own perpetuation. That's not good. Or I'm speaking right now from a rental house in DC. My family moved to this rental house from another rental house that we didn't like so much for various reasons. Our first month here was the most joyful month ever. We're in this good house in DC where everything works. Right now, as I speak, I confess I like the house. I don't think about it very much. It's amazing to get to be in a real house that works, but we don't think about that. We habituate.
Awesome, thank you. Maya?
Yes, okay, so the next one. The Economist today published an article that evidence for behavioral intervention looks increasingly shaky, citing wildly different approaches to measuring effect sizes in academic trials, and that nudge research is allegedly susceptible to publication bias. Those studies with larger effect sizes are favored in journals. The question, how should the behavioral science research community think about this moving forward? And what's your take on the state of evidence for nudging? A difficult one.
I love that question. So thank you for that. Okay, let's suppose that there are 100 nudge interventions that have had massive effects. So that automatic enrollment in savings has a massive effect in creating more savers. That automatic enrollment in green energy creates a ton more usages of green energy, making pollution go down. That automatic enrollment in anti-poverty programs creates 15 million whatevers or less poor. Okay, that's one data. Now let's suppose there's another set of studies in which the effect is modest but real. Okay, so you have another, let's say they're educative or informational interventions where the nudge has an effect. Now let's suppose you have another set of studies, a large one, where the nudge had no effect. Let's suppose the ones in which it had a huge effect is 100, the ones in which it had a significant effect is 1,000, and in 1,400 it had no effect. What do you conclude about that? Is that exciting? I think not really. You had a bunch of studies that failed. So if you have 1 million informational interventions, and we could design those, the 5 of us, that had no effect on behavior, would we conclude that informational interventions fail? No, we conclude we devise 1 million unsuccessful ones, and still a GPS device works. And if you go to an airport and it tells you where the bathroom is, people are going to go there. And if people who have, like me, a shrimp allergy are informed this food has shrimp in it, that's going to be a good thing for their health. So the hypothesis, if you took unpublished things, there's a reason they're not published. They're maybe not interesting or they're terrible. So the idea of publication bias in this context, I think we need to think more about. If I do a study that shows that if I put a little sign on my lawn that says, take steps to protect yourself against cancer, that's a nudge. And let's say no one sees my lawn, has no effect. No one's going to publish that study. That's not publication bias, it's a dumb study. So I think the enterprise of taking all the nudge studies in the world and seeing what the average effect size is, I'll phrase it bluntly, that's not an interesting study. My dog is enthusiastically agreeing in the background. My dog thinks that's the worst study he can imagine. He's a very intelligent dog. Being a little harsh on this, but the question is, what nudges have what effects and why? That's an interesting question. There are a lot of nudges that fail. I think I wrote a paper. In fact, I'm confident I wrote a paper called Nudges That Fail. And it calls out a whole lot. But that doesn't mean nudges fail. It means a bunch of them fail. If 90% of them failed, then we'd know something about the conditions under which they succeed. So I think there's some heuristic in mind. If the average information disclosure fails, that doesn't mean we should give up on information disclosures or the bad idea. Okay, I'll say one more. I'm getting a little, saying too many words about this, but I love the topic. Okay, suppose the average effect size of criminal punishment in the history of the human species, of all those for which we had data, was 0. That might even be true. That a criminal punishment on average has no effect on behavior in the history of humanity. That might be true. Then what would we conclude about that? We conclude people didn't know about the penalty, or the enforcement authority didn't have any resources. Something like that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me pass to Steve or Stephen for the next one. Who has the next question?
I can take it. Next
Okay.
question
Yes.
coming from Peru, actually. Professor Sunstein, what is your position about poor in development country governments using nudge in order to make policies? And how could you deal with the lack of data these countries actually have to deal with?
Okay, this is one of the most exciting frontiers. So I was in India a few years ago, and I've been engaged with officials in India on exactly this. And there's such an opportunity. Some great work has been done in India involving nudges and uses of behavioral science. And there's a new initiative by the government in the environmental context, which is very focused on this. And it's something that has extraordinary promise. There are other developing or poor nations where the opportunities for using nudges, whether it's about design or about educative nudges, is fantastic. The limits of resources and technological capacities are real. That's a challenge. It's also an opportunity where engagement with people in the relevant countries can produce opportunities, often relying on people there who are trusted. Your point about trust, where there might be people in a community that's really poor who have outsized impact because people trust them. So if they say something about, get vaccinated or stay away from this because this is dangerous, that's great. There was a document from, I think, the Treasury in India that was specifically on the uses of behavioral economics and nudging in India, which had not only kind of optimism about the future, but had examples from the past.
That's great. Thank you very much. Passing it on to Jillian.
I might say Rwanda, I met with the president there a few years ago, and Rwanda is using behavioral economics and nudging to great effect. People there are keenly aware of it, and Rwanda has had some spectacular, kind of amazing successes along multiple dimensions under very challenging circumstances. And that's in part due to the sophistication of the people who are trying to help.
Could you give us an example maybe of one of those success stories?
Yeah, in Rwanda, there's accountability on the part of people who are working under the top people to have frequent reporting about whether their aspirations for the relevant period have actually been carried out. So it's using transparency about achievements as a way of promoting real achievements. You can think of it in terms of books. There's a book called Scorecard Diplomacy, which is about public transparency about human trafficking as a way of reducing SAM. It's keenly informed by behavioral science, this approach. And in Rwanda, the leadership has been doing something similar with respect to a range of indicators of well-being. One thing where you can also find data publicly is the Open Government Partnership, which has dozens of nations, which is basically a nudge type intervention to get countries to have commitments for openness, and many of the commitments are themselves nudges.
Julian, do you have the next one?
Yep, I got it. So there have been a bunch of questions in this topic area, but to choose one specifically, anecdotally, the longer people are focused on and active with sustainability issues, the more they seem to focus on controlling large organizations to enforce change. They have, to varying degrees at least, given up on individuals changing their behaviors in time to deal with climate change. So could you please share your thoughts on this tension between individual agency and large organizations forcing change?
Okay, I think the reference might be to a paper by George Lowenstein on what he calls S intervention and I interventions, where I is individuals and S is, no, I'm sorry, where some are focused on institutions and some are focused on individuals. I don't have the initials quite right. Well, okay, so let's suppose you're concerned about climate change. You might think we want to encourage individuals to buy fuel efficient cars and to buy energy efficient appliances, and that there are ways to encourage individuals to do that. One way, which is pretty straightforward, is have a fuel economy label on the car that tells consumers something about environmentally relevant factors. That's focused on the individual. Another thing you might do is have a greenhouse gas inventory by which large polluters are called out publicly for their pollution. And there is a greenhouse gas inventory in the United States, and that's directed at institutions. It's in the nature of a nudge. So you could have a nudge directed at individuals. You could have one directed at institutions. Now you might think, as both Thaler and I do think, that that's not enough, and that for climate change, more is a good idea. So you might also have fuel economy regulations, which will reduce the externality by reducing greenhouse gas emissions because the cars are more fuel efficient. And though this is a controversial proposition, I believe it to be true. It's in the interest of consumers because they'll save money because the cars don't cost so much to operate. Now, the reason that's controversial is on neoclassical grounds. Consumers will kind of figure that out. You don't need regulation. But I don't agree with that. Okay, so this is a way of saying, I think the idea that there's some competition between focusing on individual behavior, let's say, and focusing on the institutions that are responsible for the macro activity that creates the harm. I think that's not the disease that ails us. The disease that ails us is that we have available tools to make the air cleaner and to reduce the risks associated with climate change, and we're not using them. Now, which should we prioritize? The one that has the highest net benefits, and that might well be the one directed at institutions. Could easily be, but if the other one also has net benefits, let's do that too. So in the US government, I'm working there now, and when I was working there under President Obama, it wasn't like a focus on nudges crowded out anything. Can't think of any case where it crowded out anything. The people who wanted the new fuel economy label also wanted legislation that would be a cap and trade program. And the people who wanted legislation for cap and trade program really liked the new fuel economy. This might be a little inside baseball, but I'll phrase it, maybe I'll phrase it very bluntly. George Lowenstein is a hero of mine. If I could give him 10 Nobel Prizes, I would. If he doesn't get one, I'll be sad. This paper is not his best paper.
Thank you. I think that framing is really optimistic, hopefully. Maya, do you want to go ahead?
Okay, so how do you overcome the habituation phenomenon you mentioned related to your current research to things like, new house or job or relationship and make it exciting and stimulating?
Okay, so one of the heroes of the book is Julia Roberts, the actor. And the reason she's a hero of the book is she was interviewed recently and asked, what do you do for excitement? What does someone like you do for fun? And she went right to her routine. She said,
Mhm.
I get up in the morning, I make breakfast. It's a very surprising answer. I make breakfast for my kids. I get them off to school. I make lunch for them. I have lunch with my husband. And by that time, it's almost 3 o'clock, and I have to pick up my kids from soccer practice. And then she stops herself and she says, this is my routine. It's boring. She says, but wait. She said, because of my job, I go off a lot.
Mm.
And then when I come back, everything has pixie dust on it. It resparkles.
Yeah.
So the idea of resparkling, I think, is the answer with respect both to bad things and terrible things. You can go away for a while and, take a vacation. And then you come back and what's good or bad about your life will be really clearer. And you might think, gosh, am I lucky and I forgot. Or you might think, I'm kind of trapped in something bad and I didn't notice. So the idea of breaks of various kinds, they can be purely psychological, is a way of reducing habituation. It's like if you're going in hot water or cold water, when you first start, it's hotness or cold is so clear. And then after 10 minutes, you don't notice. But if you step out and then go back in, you'll feel it.
Oh, that's beautiful. Beautiful. Okay, we have time for one more question before we close. Who has the last question? Anyone? Steven? Go ahead.
I can read one. Here's one. For those of us in the private sector that are encouraged to use nudges for a company's benefit, how can we, as individual designers, examine the harm that this may be inflicting on users?
The harm that nudges are inflicting on you.
Potentially. How can we put in safeguards or potentially examine the harm they may inflict on users?
Okay, that's great. So my dog also was cheering that question. I think to have ongoing evaluation is a really good idea. So if you have a nudge, which let's say is designed to get consumers to buy healthier products, it may be that it's backfiring and they think you're trying to get me to buy healthier products. I kind of hate you and I'm going to get the unhealthy products. It's called reactance, where people sometimes rebel against something and won't do it because they feel they're being asked to. So to monitor that in real time, it might be, this is actually real, not hypothetical, the automatic enrollment and savings programs in the early days, they worked, they increased participation rates, but they had an unintended bad consequence, which is because the default contribution rate was 3%, people ended up saving less. And monitoring kind of discovered that. So maybe I'll tell you a little story. When I worked for the president's, president by the Pentagon Defense Innovation Board. And on one of my first days with the Defense Innovation Board, I spoke to someone, a very distinguished Silicon Valley person, and trying to make common cause with him. I thought he'd like this. I said, cost benefit analysis is great. We should be doing a lot of that. And he looked at me as if I was from the 1920s or Mars or something and said, it's cost benefit analysis, that's terrible. And I was shocked by that. I thought, what does he like better? He said, in my company, we don't do that. And I said, why not? He said, we can't. We don't know enough. We can't project. I said, what do you do instead? He said, we test. And so that's a way of protecting against the unintended bad consequences of nudges. Test.
Amazing
Wow.
answer.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Professor Sunstein. We're so delighted to be with you today and to have this wonderful conversation. And to our audience, stay in touch with us. We'll have some events coming up in the fall, and we, of course, hope to see you again, Professor Sunstein, at our next event. Thank you all so much.
They're
We'll see you next.
fantastic questions. Thanks, everyone, and hope to see as many of you as possible in Cambridge on September 1st, when the semester begins.
Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.